AFMC is really known.
That this building will provide ideas
and also make sure
between the office hours.
Welcome to AFMC TV. I'm Robin Ledbetter. Thank you for joining us. I have with me today Dr. Derek Griffith. He is the founding co-director of the Racial Justice Institute, founder and director of the Center for Men's Health Equity, and professor of health management and policy and oncology at Georgetown, and the chair of the Global Action for Men's Health. Thank you so much, Dr. Griffith, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
First up, tell me what the Global Action of Men's Health is. What is that organization?
So there aren't very many groups globally that really focus on the health of men. I know generally we tend to think of all health as men's health in some sense because people think of men as the implicit standard for health. But the reason that we tend to focus that Global Action on Men's Health was created 10 years ago and why there is really a field of men's health is because men tend to have shorter lives than women. Really across the globe, there may be 4 or 5 countries where that's not the case, but for the most part, that is a universal pattern that we see, and that they tend to live sicker lives. And in the way that we think about it, men tend to have higher rates of things that will lead to mortality, and women will have higher rates of things that will lead to them having disabilities and just quality of life issues. And so that area across the globe takes on different contexts and so forth, as we were talking about, with folks in, say, the South Pacific Islands, just have a different context and experience with those issues. And we need to figure out how to bring those issues into the work that they do. So Global Action is really an effort to try to understand those things across the globe and to build the capacity of local, state, national, and even global entities like the World Health Organization, regional offices like Pan American Health Organization and so forth to address those kinds of issues.
And your research at Georgetown is pretty extensive. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so the big area, as you saw in the title in the center, is really men's health equity. And so I do a little bit in the health equity space that has nothing to do necessarily with men and of themselves, or I do stuff in men's health that is not really about the equity space. But one of the things that tried to carve out, not really only because of interest, but really because of need, was that men's health wasn't really dealing with the heterogeneity in men and all the diverse areas of men's race, ethnicity, even thinking about age groups in different ways, certainly sexual identity, gender orientation, sexual orientation and those kind of factors. But how do those things factor into who is sicker, who lives, who dies, and so forth? And so it was kind of at the margins, and health equity doesn't tend to deal with gender in that way or as it relates to men and males. And so we sort of had this sort of space between, we call it centering the margins of health equity and men's health, where there was this space that people weren't really occupying, but there was a real need because men's health tends to drive the racial disparities that we see. So if you think about, which groups have the highest rates of mortality, say among Black Americans, it tends to be men, or even among white Americans or other groups, it tends to be, men have shorter life expectancies than women in all those groups. And then when you come to, think about men's health, it's really the men who are potentially marginalized by, say, their race, their ethnicity, and so forth. Those are the folks who tend to have higher rates of, illness and different conditions that lead to living sicker lives or even living shorter lives.
In June was Men's Health Month. And why is it important that we should all be aware specifically of health issues regarding men?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that we tend to only think of men's health as something that is biological, or that men, just the issue is that men don't go to the doctor as much as we need to. And while those things are true and that we need to go to the doctor more, that there's so much more to men's health. And so Men's Health Month was created, I believe, by a group called the Men's Health Network that is based in DC. Also, it's another more of a US-based advocacy organization. And they are also very committed to this work. They've been doing this for about 25 years. And, they created Men's Health Month and narrowly, really, the focus tends to be Men's Health Week, which is the week leading up to Father's Day, to really raise awareness and bring attention to men. And what are the things that we need to do that we actually can do to improve men's health? So yes, we want to encourage men to go to the doctor. both for preventive things as well as when they're not feeling well or not moving around as well as they could. But also, are there other things that we can do to help men find a better balance between the lives that they lead and fulfilling the roles that are important to them and their families, as a way to sort of strive to be healthy as well as to be the anchors of the families that they hope and desire to be.
And is that something you're seeing in the United States? Is this worldwide? Is it a Southern thing? And where are you seeing those things affecting men specifically?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, like I say, a universal problem. I mean, men have a shorter life expectancy than women. And so, the Southern version that I mentioned, I grew up in Atlanta and moved to DC from Tennessee a few years ago. So, definitely steeped in the South and so forth. So there is a unique sort of context to the South of how we need to think about what kinds of things that men value about being a man, about sort of being in the context of their culture and community, about being self-reliant, being strong, and so forth, but not choosing to lean so much into those that you forget to take care of yourself, that you forget that what you eat actually matters, whether or not you get adequate sleep actually matters, how much leisure time activity you actually get matters, that those kinds of things, taking care of your body and your health, are not choices that you're making against the idea of, working enough hours to provide for your family, that you're not choosing to do that as a way to not do the kinds of things that are important for you to be active member of, say, your faith community or your, just regular community. Like, all of those things are important, but you still got to take care of your health in that context. And so part of what we're trying to do is we know that being, in certain places like the South where you value a lot of community and connection and support and so forth, that you still got to make time to make those healthier choices, make those healthier decisions, and that each of those places and spaces has a different way of thinking about those issues, but we've got to lean into those and help men strike those balances a little bit better.
So let's talk about suicide rates among men, specifically African American men. What does that look like in America? And have your studies shown a spike?
So particularly the spike that people have been really concerned about is in younger African American men. But I do want to also note that suicide and mental health tends to be a bigger issue actually for white men in the United States. So, the leading cause of death for white men are, of course, like I said, heart disease and cancer. But for white men who are 1 to 19 and 20 to 44, the second leading cause of death is actually suicide. And the third leading cause of death for those men is in the age group of 45 to 64 is suicide. Whereas for Black men, it's the third leading cause of death in 19 to 44 and is not really even a top leading cause of death beyond the age of 45. So it really is something that we have to look at. And the rise that we've seen in suicide in younger Black males, so in that below 19 age group and in that early 20s sort of age group, are where we've seen a lot of attention to that. But I don't want to make it sound like that is something that we only need to look at in Black men. We really need to deal with this, particularly in white men. And you saw that even things like the opioid epidemic was largely, again, a men's health issue. A lot of things let me say this another way. A lot of the health issues that we talk about have a really consistent gendered pattern that we don't tend to really lean into in figuring out how do we need to understand them and how do we need to address them. So if you think about everything from smoking, substance use, depression looks very different in men versus women. All of these kinds of health issues that we're talking about, even the presentation of heart disease and so forth, can look very different in men. And some of it's biological, but some of it is also psychosocial. And so we need to really understand how those factors sort of play out in their particular lives and contexts.
And there's really not a lot of attention to men's policies and policies about men's health. Why is that? And do you think what we could be doing differently?
Yeah, we've been trying to figure that out. Some of it, I think, is the way that we tend to frame the problem of men's health, that we tend to think of it as the reason that men aren't healthy is because men have all the resources and opportunities to do what they should do. They just choose not to. And that sort of framing absolves us the need to sort of have policy interventions or to, create policies that are going to help men. as opposed to recognizing there are things that we need to do that will help men actually engage in those behaviors while we honor and respect the fact that men have to take responsibility for those things themselves. So it's not a choice. We're not trying to create policies that are preventing men or that are absolving them of the responsibility to take care of themselves. We are trying to recognize that having, for example, mental health services that understand their unique challenges and strategies that and even context, that men may face, and even just symptoms of depression that men may face. So just a concrete example of that is maybe men won't sometimes express sadness or depressed mood, but you notice that they may start drinking more heavily. They may be more withdrawn. They may have more irritability and anger outbursts, maybe, more road rage, more snapping at kids and loved ones and so forth. Those can be, for clinicians, symptoms of depression in men that we tend not to label in quite the same way. We just tend to label okay, he's having a bad day or so forth. But if those are persistent patterns for a week or two, then those can be actually symptoms of depression that we need to really pay attention to, particularly if they're starting to happen as alongside other things that are also impeding their relationships and their ability to function in their daily lives.
And so you've mentioned substance abuse and opioids are becoming an even greater problem, and that more men died from opioids during that period after COVID than women.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that what your research is telling you? And do you think that there should be a gender lens to this?
I do, and I think that the importance of the gender lens is that it would benefit everybody. So we need a gender lens to better understand why women, why we don't have enough services for women either. So again, this is not to say the effort to improve men's health and to have resources to promote men's health is in no way an effort to take resources away from women's health or even those who don't fit our gender binary. It's really to say that there are unique things that are gendered that we really need to pay attention to that affect men and that affect the way that we receive men. So said another way, the notions about men in terms of how we deal with pain and how we deal with, relationships and so forth, those aren't just reinforced by men. They're also reinforced by women in their lives, regardless of sort of their age. So whether it's sisters, mothers, and so forth, loved ones, and what have you. So it's really understanding that those things occur in a community and in a context that we have to appreciate. And a gendered lens to these things from a policy standpoint would really help us better serve women, better serve men, and those who don't fit that binary.
And what would you say are the unique factors that racial ethnic men are battling?
I think it's just, as you described, it's really the combination of what are the unique contextual factors that speak to the way that men are experienced who are of a particular racialized group, say, African American or even Latino men, that there are ways that we think about the challenges that they have that are really about the opportunities they have to make a decent wage, to, face different challenges when they are dealing with different spaces that they may they may not get the same return on an educational investment. So if I get a 4-year degree and a white colleague gets a 4-year degree, we won't necessarily make the same money coming out of school. Or the same thing, you see the same thing with white women versus other groups with say white women versus white men, that you have groups that are not necessarily marginalized in different ways across different areas of society. And so those kinds of things combined with the gendered norms and expectations that we have of all men, we have to look at how those things intersect or combine in unique ways to influence how men see themselves and how they're valued or appreciated by other groups. So if you're not fulfilling what people think you should in your family and your community think you should be doing as a man, it very much affects how you're seeing yourself and how people receive you and treat you. Are they treating you with respect or are they not? Because you're not a man because you're not providing for your family. You're not a man because you're not, actively involved with your community. Is it those kinds of things that we're sort of taking and that they will also internalize that have implications for their health and well-being?
Tell me about this recent research project that you've worked on regarding cancer.
Yeah, so we're very fortunate as part of my role with Global Action on Men's Health to recently launch a report The initial title is Gone Missing, and it's about looking at whether or not how men are represented or are they represented in global cancer policies. And so it's looking at national and when we say regional reports, we're meaning like the Pan American Health Organization or groups that are looking at regions of the world and the World Health Organization and so forth. And that those have implications for the ways that we look at things within nations, then states and locally. And what we found in that report, or what the folks, Natalie Leon and Chris Colvin found, who were the authors of the report, was that just globally, there was really, often we didn't disaggregate data by sex and gender. So we didn't usually have a lot of information about what are the unique patterns that would actually, that you're seeing, by gender within a particular country or within a particular context. And if you don't have that information, then you can't actually intervene on it and deal with it in any kind of way. When they did disaggregate or even look at gender as it related to males, there wasn't a lot of very thoughtful or sophisticated or even just, intentional way of explaining, expanding, and addressing the gender patterns they saw as it related to males. If gender was mentioned and it was dealt with in a much more sophisticated way, it tended to be in relation to women. And so this helps to explain why we're continuing to see this persistent pattern of men dying at higher rates of cancer, across the globe and so forth. And even though infectious disease like COVID and HIV and those kinds of things are continuing to be a major problem across the globe, we're also seeing, even in lower income countries where HIV has been really rampant, that what you're actually starting to see is this wave of non-communicable diseases, they call them, which is basically what we call chronic diseases here in the States, of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth, as being the things, as we export McDonald's as much as we export everything else, that those kinds of things are the things that we're starting to see are starting to have be higher, bigger causes of death or leading causes of death in those particular groups. And we're starting to see them have to suffer those kind of health issues in ways that we had not seen before.
So in close, are we ambivalent to men suffering despite their advantages?
Ambivalent is a loaded term. I would say that we're underappreciating men's health, men's suffering. I know that part of that language, came from a piece that was in the Washington Post not too long ago that I was quoted in, where they talked about the silent men's health crisis and so forth. And I mean, I think for some that is a useful framing to bring attention to it, but for others, that tends to be a very polarizing and a very negative way to frame it. I think the point is that we need to pay attention to subgroups of our population as Americans, that everybody needs a different, there's some things that everybody needs, but then there are unique things that sometimes each population needs. It's not a more or less, sometimes it's just different. And so realizing that men's health requires a different approach than it does women's health, or assuming we have to recognize that even an approach that doesn't consider gender explicitly actually does have a gendered approach underlying it, because most of those approaches to promoting health and well-being, having health fairs and so forth, came out of successful models that were largely developed based on engaging with women. And we haven't really had a good way to engage with men in those spaces. And so we don't have the same kind of infrastructure for that.
Well, Dr. Griffith, this is so interesting. I've learned so much today, and I'm sure that our audience will too. And I'm so appreciative of the research and what you do to give back to everyone that reads it. So well done. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode of AFMC TV. I'm Robin Ledbetter. Thank you for watching and have a great day.